Hi, I'm here with Nicholas Kirkue, who is a person who uh, is a lot younger than I am, but represents many young people who are in the labor force, moving into the labor force, and somebody who may or may not have an interest in unions sometime in their lifetime. And so I thought it would be interesting to ask Nicholas to give us his impressions about unions, and this discussion could then be insightful in trying to understand what is that next generation really looking for in terms of workplace. So Nicholas, if you think about unions, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Teddy Roosevelt, probably. Um, the early 1900s were like a prime time for the labor movement, especially coming out of like the Industrial Revolution, the Spanish-American War, and then heading towards World War I. Labor was really defining America at the time, especially during World War I, because we were, a high manufacturer, a high economic impact on the war. So I get like a sense of like I'd say like pride when I think of unions. But that being said, I also think a lot about like the decline of unions in my lifetime. Seeing my parents enter and exit union workforces, a lot of my friends, family members leaving unions, and then a lot of legislation in the last couple of years since I've been aware of like the modern progression towards like an ununionized workforce, of like the effects that's having on people's lives in America.
So do you think there's ever going to be a time in your lifetime, your work time, that you're going to be in a union?
It's really hard to say at this point. So we all know that unions have been on a decline partially for a lot of reasons. And one of those big reasons is the youth's involvement in higher education rates. So for instance, last August, a report was released that said, something like 1.7% decrease in the month of August alone of labor force involvement among the youth ages 16 to 24. And it makes sense that a lot of people coming out of college with degrees from university, there's less of a union incentive because a lot of the careers they're going into are private contractors, and a lot of the times they don't have the opportunity to unionize. That being said, it's hard to say also because that isn't the fault of unions as much as that's the fault of our modern labor climate. There's not much of a labor movement in America compared to some of our European brothers and sisters, and I think that is really a reflection of the direction we're heading is kind of diminishing the value of labor in the market. And so I'd like to be a part of a union in my life. I'm studying civil engineering and sustainability. There's definitely room for union, and especially in the engineering field.
Yeah.
It's just the strength of unions too is really, it's unpredictable at this point with right to work laws in Michigan and basically being the federal law of the land at this point. It's hard to say where unions will be 5, 10, 15 years down the line.
Okay. When you think about union activity that's going on right now, do you ever come in contact with somebody who's organizing a union?
Actively organizing a union? No.
Okay.
No, I haven't. I have a good friend who went into the union right out of high school. He's already making almost twice as much money as I am, putting in 60 hours of work a week. He was fortunate enough to be accepted into the apprenticeship without even putting in a full year. And his dad has been in the union for over 20 years. So I'm exposed to people who have an active involvement in unions, and I see the way that just significantly benefits their lives, being able to collectively bargain for better wages. They get a much more structured and adequate health care than someone like I would. They have the ability to negotiate for days off and sick days, and they don't have to worry about losing their jobs when they make petty mistakes. But I also see the way it can negatively impact people's lives. You get bad laborers in a union. One bad apple can spoil the entire bunch in a lot of ways. Because they bargain for their ability to keep their jobs, it's hard to really weed out bad workers. But that's the structure of a union is incredibly democratic for the most part. Whether you see that on one side of the spectrum as being like a mob democracy or on the other side of the spectrum as being an efficient democracy, that's up to you. But they're democratic nonetheless.
Yeah.
And I'd say at this point they're one of the most democratic structures in America. So yeah, exposed to people in the union for sure. Actively organizing unions, no, it gets harder by the day.
Well, what do you think it would take for union people to get people in your age group? And I know you can't speak for everybody, but you can speak from your perspective. What would it take for union people to get people like you to think about organizing, or how would that be possible? Does it require social media? What are the ways in which unions can get more young people to think that union might be to their benefit?
The easiest way I feel like unions would be able to accomplish this would to be supporting legislators and legislation that has a direct impact on the youth. It's hard to convince young people my age now that unions are the way to go, because they think of their grandparents coming out of Vietnam and having adequate health care, being able to afford a house with one job, a house and 2 cars, and sending their kids to college. And that's, one, incredibly intimidating to somebody like myself to think about. The amount of effort that I'd have to put forth to achieve the same thing in the same amount of time would just be astronomical compared to somebody like my grandfather. And I think unions do that to an extent, hedging their bets on a lot of legislators, especially here in Michigan, that are going to support reform like that. But it's what a union supports and what the individual union members support are 2 different things. And that's important, because to attract me to a union, I'd have to think, they need to be able to prove that they're actually standing up for my rights as a laborer. And yet again, as I mentioned before, that's not a fault of unions per se, as much as it's the current legislative climate we're in. And with right to work, the restrictions being imposed on unions, banning the right to strike, that's one of that's a union's strongest tool. It's the ability to strike, and strike officially. Nowadays you'd have to organize everybody to call into work. In a lot of states, think of like the teachers in Virginia not being able to go on strike. And unions are kind of being used as a mechanism to pit, I'd say, the working class and the middle class against each other in a lot of ways. For the Virginia incident, that was, a lot of people said, oh, you shouldn't be able to strike because these kids are losing their education. But first of all, I'd say if you actually cared about their education, then those kids would be getting a decent education. That's a whole other story. But on the other side of things,
we'll pick that up at another time.
yeah. You'll have to have me here again. But on the other side of things, the strike was important because it's hard for teachers to teach kids adequately when they have to worry about affording to feed their own. And that's ultimately what unions can achieve if we have a stronger labor movement in America. We could have adequate wages. We wouldn't have to work, it wouldn't be like the norm to be working 3 jobs in America.
Well, you mentioned healthcare. If we go to a national healthcare system and healthcare is provided through something like Medicare for all or some kind of universal coverage, where do you think the unions then fit into that process? Because unions were at the front end of getting health insurance for their workers right after World War II and throughout the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. But if it becomes a national health insurance plan, do unions still have a role, you think? Or what would happen for that for you?
Well, ultimately, I think that unions have to be the spearhead of the movement again. So
you're saying what unions should do right now to help make themselves relevant is organize behind promoting health care for everybody? Not just for union members.
Yeah, correct. Okay. When you think about it, 40 years ago, not everybody was unionized, but collective bargaining for superior wages did have an impact on everybody's jobs. And so I think with the decline of union involvement among people, especially among people who don't have high school diplomas, you'd think those are the people going into the workforce, the labor force, and wanting to join unions. But they aren't, and it's a little known incentive because unions, in Michigan in particular, when you get strong unions like the police union, for instance, they're supporting legislators oftentimes that aren't very progressively minded. And that gives unions a bad image, especially to people like myself.
So you're saying people pay attention to who union members support, and if union members support somebody who doesn't really look out for the interest of people who need help to get better wages or health care, unions look pretty bad in the eyes of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Okay.
it's one thing to support monetarily. We all know that unions are hedging their bets on legislators, but you have to be out there in the field, really putting in the work and leading the progressive movement, however you define that, especially when it comes to adequate health care and wages. Because right now, a lot of young people are being forced to work jobs that aren't necessarily great. People use McDonald's as an example.
Yeah.
Of like a subpar job.
Yeah.
And whether or not McDonald's employees should unionize, I think that's a less important issue to talk about than why are young people being forced into these positions to have to work those jobs, especially if they aren't getting a college education, when they would be much easier to turn to a skilled trade.
Well, I have two questions for you. One, let me ask the first one quickly. Have you ever met a union organizer?
I have not.
Okay, so in your whole lifetime, you've never come across anybody
No,
who
I've not.
said, "Hey, would you like to join a union?"
Nope. I have
Okay.
not.
Second question, and this is related to, I know you're going to school. College is very expensive now,
Yeah.
and university costs are very high. Is there going to be some kind of reckoning because of that, in that what I'm saying is, are less people going to go to college, and is there going to be people in the workforce that don't have college education that are going to need some kind of representation or help to have a living wage?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say
Now, I know you work at it, for instance, you work at a coffee shop,
I do.
and I'm not going to ask you how much you make, but could you live on the money that you make as a barista or whatever in that coffee shop?
I am incredibly fortunate to have kind of worked my way up in the atmosphere itself. So would I be able to, not at the same standard of living that somebody like you may be living at, but I'd be sacrificing a lot.
Yeah.
Car insurance would kind of be an optional thing
Yeah.
at that point.
Okay.
But for a lot of my coworkers, absolutely not. And I do have coworkers who, weren't able to achieve a college education, dropped out after 2 or 3 years.
Sure.
And they're relying on working 2 or 3 jobs right now just to be able to make it by.
Well, you had mentioned apprenticeship programs and how unions brought people in, taught them skilled trades or whatever, and then these people were able to get into a good paying job with benefits and so forth. Is that a place where unions need to go back to and look at the landscape in terms of apprenticeships or some kind of program to prepare people for these occupations? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it almost goes hand in hand with this idea that nowadays where people think like unions and college are mutually exclusive. Like that's how people see it.
Okay.
You're either going to get a degree or you're going to go into a union. But I don't think it has to be that way. I think that's a divide that was created by people who want you to make that decision.
Interestingly enough, this past week, the researchers at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and most of these people are PhDs and people who are researchers from universities or whatever, who are working for the Ag Department, unionized. They became,
Okay.
I mean, so they're college educated. These are people with PhDs. These are people
That's
who
great.
probably come from university backgrounds. I'm a university professor. We're organized.
Right.
I'm in a union. So it's not like colleges and universities are necessarily exclusive in that way. But I think there is, like you said, some degree of division there that does exist.
Correct, yeah.
And somehow that needs to be looked at more closely. So
Yeah.
if you finish your college degree in engineering and so forth, and you go out in the workforce, you may be working someplace where there isn't a union. I have three family members who are engineers, and they work in various industries, and none of those are unionized, at least not that I know of. What do you think would happen if you became a person in that work field? Would you ever consider a union?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would consider a union. And this is kind of my thought on unions and what's happening in America today with the lack of a strong labor movement. Is there's like this
lack of a strong labor movement. Flesh that out a little bit. How do you see that?
Yeah, so really there's this notion in America that economic proficiency trumps personal well-being. And I think we could all see that today, right? Americans are working longer hours. Divorce rates are high. Families are being destroyed because there isn't, the mom and dad are both working. The kids are growing up in troubled environments. Maybe one's going back to school and working 2 jobs. And this is an issue because it's like a self-perpetuating cycle in a lot of ways. I'm working 3 jobs to barely make it by. I'm raising kids who see that that's like the standard in America. Mm-hmm. And we're all doing it to push this economic giant, essentially. But nobody's ever stopping to look at maybe how they're feeling. And it seems a little, 20 years ago I said that it would seem a little hippie-ish in a way. To be, well, how I feel doesn't matter. I need money to make me happy. And I think what unions offer, especially strong unions in a labor movement-based society, is you're guaranteed work. You're guaranteed to be giving back to society. But in return, not only are you getting decent wages, livable wages, but you're also getting guaranteed health care. That's an expense you have to worry less about. You're getting guaranteed protection, job protection, something you have less to worry about. You don't have to diversify your income as much. And in turn, that means that you get to spend more time with the people you care about. And you get to spend more time with yourself. And you get to develop new skills. You could go back to school. Because, like I said, you don't need to not go to college if you go into a union. And so I think when I say there's a lack of a strong labor movement, what I really picture is how we put very little importance on laborers' rights. And essentially it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. You grow up expecting to become a cog in a machine, and that's essentially the role that you're fulfilling. But we could have something stronger than that. We could have a progressive labor movement, which allows people to have a place in society, a guaranteed place in society. We could keep unemployment low. We could bring manufacturing back to America. And in doing all of that, we're kind of getting a win-win situation. We're getting a workforce that feels validated, that has a place in society. Essentially labor, we could all agree that labor is the foundation of society. Mm-hmm. Who's going to build the economic giant that America is without a strong labor movement? And they're being walked over, and this is why over half of the wealth gets sent to the top 1%. And this is why we see, people working 3 jobs but struggling to make it by.
Well, the businessman's solution to that is that they need to make more profit in order to hire more people. And the Republican tax cut people are saying that they need more tax cuts to give more money into the pockets of business entrepreneurs, yeah, right, so that they can create more jobs. Mm-hmm. So how does the labor movement fit into all of that, or how do you fit into all that?
Well, what I like about that idea that you mentioned is that we're still hanging on to it, even though in the last 100 years it hasn't worked at all. Okay. It's very common. After 2 Bush presidencies, you'd think we'd realize that this isn't the way to run an economic system.
I think they tried this in Kansas, too.
Yeah, I'm sure they try it a lot of places in America. But so to your first point, that we need more money to hire more people, I think it would make sense if we were hiring more people in jobs that have that are protected. And what I mean by that is we're moving into a more digitalized world, a more artificially intelligence-based world, and a more automated world. And this is all happening without, few people are looking at it. You walk in a Meijer and somebody might reprimand you for using a self-checkout, but they don't realize that, look at a car manufacturer, look at the UAW. How many of those jobs went from skill-based, physical labor on an assembly line to more like review-based? Just making sure that the robots are meeting their quality standards. In reality, what we need is to be investing more money, not to hire more people in coal mines and power plants. We need to be investing more money into things like renewable energy. It's a larger investment up front, but what you're doing is you're creating jobs that are going to last into the future.
So one of the things that you would say to union people is then push renewable energy because there's more jobs there, push some of these new cutting-edge technologies, but help people who are going into them to become organized so that they do have benefits, they have worker rights, they have the ability to organize and make decisions, maybe profit sharing, whatever, those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe some and maybe this is an important thing too, some guarantees about having job security.
Yeah, absolutely. If we quit moving manufacturing outside of the United States,
Yeah.
if we start bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., but we start capitalizing on this opportunity to be like a global leader in renewable energy, then I mean, no one could argue that wouldn't create a surplus of jobs. Coal is on a decline, but large oil companies and coal companies are grasping at straws at this point. And what they're doing is they're funding legislators who are propagating the same kind of speech that they've got, which is the future is in coal unions. The future is in, southern labor unions fighting for oil, and it's simply not true. And it's very obvious at this point that we're moving away from this old energy, and we could invest in jobs, and we could train. You could have, skill training.
Sure. Well, I would imagine if we look at, let's say, apprenticeship programs or programs that teach people skills outside of college, such as repairing power stations or windmills or whatever, doing the kind of stuff that does require labor. Somebody's got to climb up to one of these wind turbines and actually repair it. There's a man that has to go up there and do
Absolutely.
that. There's not a robot yet that can do that.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and they're putting up more of these, and you're saying if you put more of these up, you create more jobs for people who
Absolutely.
need this. Okay.
Yeah.
So, let's get back to something else that your vision or thoughts are about, and that's this whole idea of changing the paradigm in terms of how we look at ourselves, and in particular how we look at ourselves as a nation, not as a nation of coal miners and I guess it would be old manufacturing kinds of things, but as a nation of progressive young people who are socially mobile, have skills in computers and social media and those kinds of things, a labor force that can be engaged in some 5K kinds of business opportunities and extending beyond just the kind of the lifestyles that we've seen in the past. Go ahead and talk about how you think your world would look like in 20 years that we can't see right now because we're still looking backwards.
Right, absolutely. And there's a lot to be said about that, like the way that America's heading. And one thing that I'd like to start with is this interesting observation when you think about it, is that America really was the forefront of this new globalist world that we're living in, this globalized world. And I think it's a good thing to connect communities, near and far, transcontinentally, and that increases our economic abilities and economic mobility, and geographic mobility in a way too. Yet what happens is in America specifically, where the rest of the world is taking advantage of this globalized market and training skilled laborers to go and work in different countries or at home, and certain manufacturing stays here, goes there. In America, we're in a lot of ways we're kind of rolling over. And we're saying, this globalized world, man, it's leaving me in the dust. But really, it starts here at home. And by increasing our domestic profitability as a nation, and specifically in like our mental well-being, which is something I hit on earlier, I think it would really allow us to continue to lead that globalized revolution. But it starts here at home. And if you don't mind hitting on this a little bit more, is I think this starts in a lot of ways in cities in particular. I'd like to mention too, like I have friends who, they don't want to go to college. They never like school. But they don't want to go into unions because they don't like welding. That's how they see it. Those are their options. Okay. So they work at, McDonald's, Olive Garden. But what if, we start reconstructing cities, start building cities around people instead of around manufacturing? We start building cities around everybody's well-being. It'll kind of translate into this kind of like a personal revolution, like an internal revolution, and that increases people's morale and it increases people's ability to work and geographic mobility.
Well, you just gave me a lead-in. I've been around the world a couple times, seen brand new cities in China, new cities being built in India and so forth. And then I come back to the United States and I see our old infrastructure. I see our old buildings, roads, et cetera, bridges. There's a lot of opportunity for work there. And it's going to require people. I mean, we can make robots that put concrete down, but there still needs to be somebody running it, and there's a bunch of things that are a part of that. Do you think then that if there is a revolution that is essentially led by young people to change the way America is mentally and physically, and you haven't mentioned much about the environment, but changing the environment, because there certainly is climate change, despite what people might want to believe. And again, that's looking backward, and I think you're looking forward. And I think that's the important nexus here, is that we're at this point where a generation of millennials and all the people that come behind it are going to replace a generation of boomers who are leaving. They're dying. They're gone. And it's going to be your world. What does your world need, and how do you think the unions fit into that?
All right. Think about what we could do if we said, okay, well, I like clean water and clean air, and I want my kids to have a breathable future. And you mentioned the environment. We could build cities to be more environmentally friendly and be more labor friendly.
Well, let's go to the environment real quick. I'm concerned about the environment, as many people aren't. The environment is really at a tipping point. And we can do a lot of things to change that. And there's a whole industry there, a huge industry that could be developed around, reclaiming a lot of things, that water, air, the oceans, there's a variety of things. Infrastructures that are polluted or whatever, or are decaying. We can put a lot of people to work. And the thought I've had here is that that's not going to happen without organization.
Absolutely not.
And people like you and I who might be interested in that, there's two of us. But if there was a labor union of people who were with us and working on the environment, and we were all working towards the idea of not only improving the environment, but channeling people into that would have good paying jobs that would be organized by the union, it's a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody's going to come out of that ahead. And this may be something that people don't agree with me about, but I think that part of the reason that we have this environmental decline is because we've put profits first. The stock exchange is more important than the human exchange. And so as we keep thinking about how to generate more money for, as you said, a smaller group of people, there's a larger group of people that aren't getting anything. And part of that is the decay and all the discard that comes from profit first, because as these companies try to make more money, the idea of protecting the environment doesn't fit into that. There is no triple bottom line for most of these corporations. It's mostly about shareholder profits and, of course, profits for those people who run the company.
And absolutely. And, the stock exchange is indicative of American prosperity, right?
Yeah.
And it's important that we have a good economy. But what is a good economy for, if not for a good people?